Thank you, Christian. Now we have Saul Walker from CEPI in London. Please, Saul.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just waiting for the clicker. Thanks. So I'm Saul Walker. I'm from CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, a bit of a mouthful, so CEPI. I'm going to talk a little bit about our mission, which is essentially to accelerate the development and support the equitable access to vaccines against emerging epidemic and pandemic threats. Although that's our mission, I want to also say that that's increasingly a mission that others share in, and Dr. Taj already discussed the Africa CDC plan, and we're very privileged to be working with Africa CDC on a joint action plan that's supporting the innovation and epidemic preparedness work that Africa CDC takes forward, and really aligning our work with Africa CDC's objectives. You can see there also the European Commission's medical countermeasures strategy that Hira and Laurent and others are taking forwards. You've got down in the bottom there the ASEAN vaccine self-sufficiency and reliance strategy that is being taken forward by ASEAN. PAHO has also had resolutions in 24 and 25 around innovation and manufacturing capability for broader health technology development, but also for a pandemic response, and of course, the pandemic agreement as well. So just one of the things CEPI is trying to do is build on the lessons that we saw from COVID, and we've seen already during this conference a few of the issues that came up from COVID, some positive, some not so positive. But what we did learn in terms of the historically fast development of vaccines was that having a head start on both the viral family, coronaviruses, for COVID, but also around vaccine technologies, really allowed us to move very, very quickly on the development of a new vaccine. There'd been investment for mRNA technologies for about 20 years before COVID. CEPI had been working with others, and others had been investing in work on other coronaviruses, MERS, for example, but also other coronaviruses. So we weren't starting from scratch when we had COVID arrived. We also had regulators that were prepared to innovate in terms of how they worked together and in terms of how they were prepared to grant emergency use licenses for vaccines, but also to look at issues around rolling review of data, and also different models to approve vaccines. So, for example, for the variant-specific vaccines that were needed later in the epidemic and in the pandemic, we're looking at immunobridging models rather than going through large-scale clinical trials again. We did see some innovations in clinical trials. We saw the recovery trial in the UK, for example, but they were highly variable in quality and in scale, difficulty to work across different trials and comparability, difficulty in conducting head-to-head trials, difficulties in looking at combinations of vaccines. So really some learning to be done there, and some of that's come together in the WHO clinical trials regulation for a few years ago and is being taken forwards. But really we need to do more on clinical trials. And particularly, I think Lauren mentioned yesterday in terms of cross-country clinical trials, and in the European Union also taking that forwards at the moment, and Reno and the European Vaccine Hub working on that too. We did see this issue around supply and in the inequity of supply, and although COVAX and Emanuele talked to this, was the most successful and the fastest rollout of vaccines in history, 2 billion doses in about 2 years. That still was very inequitable in terms of how quickly that coverage was achieved, in part due to purchasing power, but it also in part to the concentration of vaccine manufacturing capability. And then by the time we saw some of those vaccines becoming available in low and middle income countries, actually we then ran into health systems challenges and unavailability of resources to support rollout. So we didn't really think about the demand side. It was a very supply-driven approach often, and thinking about that earlier was something that would be crucial. So CEPI has been thinking about how do we take those lessons and how do we apply them to moving faster next time. And you can see there's just the standard vaccine development and approval timeline is 5 years plus. In COVID, it was done in 326 days. We looked at if you continue just to try and squeeze the timelines with some of these standard approaches, you could probably get it down to around 200 days. But what CEPI really wants to do is work with others to put the tools, the technologies, the relationships, the trust, the financing together during a preparedness phase so that when we need to, we could go potentially to get that done in 100 days, from sequencing of a pathogen to first approval. Now, that 100 days is the sprint at the end of a marathon. The crucial piece here, as it is always for emergency response, is preparation, is readiness, is trust, and knowing how to work together. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we're thinking about that. So we're beginning to think about how do you bring together the capabilities that you're going to need to be able to go fast when you need to. And there's 4 broad quadrants here. The first is around early detection and initiation, so being able to get data quickly, to be able to start responses early, well before a fake is declared, particularly for R&D. Actually starting early when you have signals is really important, and then being able to ramp off if you need to, but to take no regret or low regret decisions early so that we get moving quickly. If you then move into actually how you develop vaccines, and you do that in an accelerated way, how do you have research and development and manufacturing partners that are already networked, that already know how to work together in order to move candidates forwards quickly? How potentially, going back to that lesson from COVID, where we had experience around platforms and experience around pathogen families, how could you have prototype vaccines for the key viral families that mean when we're faced with a novel pathogen from one of those families that we're not starting from scratch, that we've already got a head start? And how do you work with established vaccine platforms, mRNA, protein, viral vectors, for which you can begin to develop regulatory data for which regulators and manufacturers are already familiar, so you can work quickly when you need to? Obviously, regulatory approval is critical, and we saw some of the innovations there in COVID. It's critical in moving quickly. It's also critical to trust, clearly. And thinking about trust in regulatory and in vaccines is going to be critical. But we can move quickly and safely, and I'll come on to that in a bit later on. And then, obviously, the point about manufacturing is we saw this super concentration in COVID. We need to see more diversified geographic and strategic investments in manufacturing capability. But that capability needs to be economically viable between pandemics. So how do we think about the interaction between non-pandemic and pandemic business models that can support viable economic manufacturing ecosystems? So those are the kind of the broad capability areas, but underlying that, I think, and one of the things that CEPI really wants to focus on as well, is how do we innovation deliberately in a way that we can reduce complexity, reduce cost, improve flexibility, improve scalability on the manufacturing side. So actually you can come up with innovation models and manufacturing models that are more viable to operate at regional level. And then how do you actually then have the connections across those regions so that they can work together? It's really important that we go to regional leadership, but what we don't want to end up with is regional balkanization. So I'm going to talk about some of the examples of that work. So thinking about, I'm not going to talk so much about the first quadrant, which was the surveillance and rapid detection, although we are doing work there, particularly on AI modeling of probabilities of zoonotic spillover and pandemic threat with the Vista network and the Beacon network, and we can talk about that if we want to. But I'm going to focus a little bit on the R&D piece first. I mentioned the viral families work, and I think someone yesterday flashed up the WHO scientific framework for pathogen prioritization, which has identified 25 pathogen families from which you are most likely to see epidemic or pandemic pathogens emerge. A number of different organizations are beginning to use this framework. HERA is, SCADA is, BARDA, several others. We're working with this too. In fact, CEPI is covering about 9 viral families at the moment, potentially taking candidate vaccines through to phase 1 or to phase 2 studies, and where we can have support and partnership with others taking those through to licensure. So, for example, I'll come on to Lassa in a moment. We're working on a Lassa vaccine, but we're also working on arenaviruses more generally. Lassa can provide us with information around arenavirus vaccines. Working on vaccine platforms, critical to do that. How do we support work on mRNA or viral vectors or protein platforms that allow us more flexibility and more rapid scale up and more adaptability to new pathogens as they emerge. And we can do that in a way that means that, as I said earlier, regulators, manufacturers can have familiarity with those platforms, so when you need them, you can move more quickly. We're talking about, and you can see here, some of the network partners that we're working with on clinical trials, but also in the yellow dots, so that's the preclinical model. So we're working with a number of laboratories on animal models, but also a centralized laboratory network. So that we've got clinical trial capability, we've got labs that can do standardized assays, can work with standardized operating procedures that mean you can do comparability across clinical trials and do cross-country clinical trials. You can link then also into a manufacturing network so that once you're doing your clinical product development, you're already thinking about CMC, you're already thinking about manufacturing, and you have a manufacturing strategy in mind as well. And you've worked with those partners so that if you're looking to do technology transfer, that you can do that more quickly. The hardest thing to do during COVID was to try and do technology transfer in the middle of a pandemic. It was never really going to work. It will only really work if we can actually have those partners in place beforehand with the familiarity with the technologies and the trust in each other as well. And then enabling sciences down the bottom. I'm not going to go much into the AI work that we do, but we are seeing AI as a critical tool, particularly if you're looking at vaccine platforms and antigen design, that you can use AI to do rapid development of immunogens you can then work with different vaccine platforms on. So, and the other thing I should have said actually right at the start, and I'll come on to now, is as we talk about these capabilities, it's critical that we think about them being regionally and geographically anchored. So how do these capabilities, how can they be distributed? How can they add up to a contribution to delivering rapid and equitable vaccines quickly in a pandemic? How do we think regionally? The example here is from Lassa in West Africa, where we've taken forward the Lassa vaccine. We've had a ministerial meeting recently with countries from Côte d'Ivoire, you can see Minister Pate from Nigeria there, with WAHO, about how countries in West Africa will support the development of a Lassa vaccine, but critically, not just thinking about the Lassa vaccine as a Lassa vaccine, but Lassa as a way to build core capabilities for innovation and manufacturing in West Africa. And then bringing in other investors, I mean, similar to the approach that Priya talked about, to invest in systems, to invest in capabilities that can then be applied to other vaccine needs, whether that be mpox or filoviruses, but also to other health research if needed. I talked about regulatory approaches, and critically there, bringing together different regulatory authorities, and CEPI hosting a regulatory advisory group with WHO that's bringing together 13 regulatory authorities from all WHO regions to think about how collectively they could work together on accelerated approval for outbreak type products. And here's some of the things that they're going to be looking at. Accelerated regulatory processes for epidemic and pandemic preparedness, looking at more proactive approaches to shared review of vaccine or pandemic product products as they're going through clinical trials, using the opportunities of AI to support and digital systems to support collaboration to do that. I mentioned manufacturing. CEPI is working with manufacturing partners in numerous countries, and you can see here those that we're working with in Latin America, in Africa, in India, and in Indonesia. What we're doing here is working with partners that already have an established routine vaccine business. Outbreak vaccines, unfortunately, are not a very good business model by themselves, but we are working with partners that do have these routine business models, and then adding capability to that, whether that be new vaccine platforms or strengthening some of their existing capabilities and being able to connect them to an R&D ecosystem so that we can bring vaccines to those partners when we need to in the future. And that being a trusted network of partners before an outbreak occurs. Very, very briefly, this is how we might link across different networks. This is for some work we're doing for H5N1, working with the Houston Methodist Research Institute on immunogen design around H5N1, linking to that to a partnership that we have with Serum Institute of India to do some development of prototype vaccines, linking that with work we're doing with UKHSA in the UK to look at how we then test those products in animal studies, and then working with the MHRA also in the UK to think about what that would mean in terms of regulatory pathways. And doing that now, so that if we do see H5N1, and we saw some of the, well, maybe lack of data from the US, of this being a real potential, that we're ready to go. And that's linking across regions. And so that's that important point of not just working in regions, but linking across regions. So very lastly then, the session is the role of international organizations. So what can international organizations do? Well, innovation is a public good. More minds are better in science in general. So how can we generate and share knowledge effectively? And CEPI can be a linker in sharing that knowledge. Collaborative thought leadership. So that's convening shared goals and regional leadership. So actually that's linking behind regions, being allies of regional leadership, but being thought partners in that. I think regional leadership is critically important, but that doesn't mean we just say, okay, over to you now, we're done here, we're walking away. How do we actually have a respectful partnership there in supporting that leadership? Linking across regions and sectors, as I've said, mobilizing and aligning financial and other resources is really critical, and Emanuele talked through some of the key elements there that Gavi's putting in place with the Rapid Response Fund and other of their financial mechanisms, and that pull side, who buys what from whom, is going to be critical in making this tick in terms of actually driving vaccine development in the future. Standards and tools for networking and collaboration is going to be critical. WHO has a key role there, but also regional organizations. If we can have shared metrics, if we can have shared standards, that allows networking and it allows interoperability. And then, of course, aligning with and being ready for response. You can have those capabilities, you can have the organizations, but unless we know how to work together in practice, we're still just going to be running around wondering who to ring in an emergency. So we have to practice this and have to think about the operational pieces ahead of time. And CEPI is a partner in doing that in Africa, in Latin America, working with PAHO, working with WHO, working with Gavi, UNICEF, and others. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.